Picture this. 500 Spanish conquistadors land on the coast of Mexico and somehow manage to topple an empire of 15 million people in just 2 years. If you believe that's the whole story, you've been sold one of history's biggest oversimplifications. The fall of the Aztec Empire wasn't a simple David versus Goliath story, where European technology and tactics overwhelmed primitive natives. The real story is far more complex and reveals a perfect storm of factors that had been building for decades before Hernán Cortés ever set foot in the New World. But here's what most history books don't tell you about what actually happened to the Aztecs. The Spanish were more like the final straw that broke the camel's back, rather than the unstoppable force that single-handedly destroyed a civilization. The Aztec Empire in 1519 wasn't the unified, powerful state that many people imagine. It was a collection of conquered city-states held together by fear, tribute payments, and military force. The empire was riddled with internal tensions, resentful subject peoples, and political instabilities that made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of disruption that Spanish arrival would create. What makes this story even more fascinating is that the Aztecs actually had several opportunities to destroy the Spanish completely during those crucial first 2 years. They had superior numbers, knowledge of the terrain, and initial military successes that should have ended the conquest before it began. The fact that they didn't succeed reveals just how many different factors were working against them simultaneously. The real story of the Aztec collapse involves deadly diseases, massive native alliances against Aztec rule, internal political crises, religious beliefs that paralyzed decision-making, and yes, Spanish military tactics, all combining in ways that created a cascade of disasters no empire could have survived. The empire built on resentment. The Aztec Empire wasn't really an empire in the traditional sense. It was more like a protection racket that had grown to continental proportions. The Aztecs, who called themselves the Mexica, had built their power by conquering neighboring city-states and forcing them to pay tribute rather than integrating them into a unified political system. This tribute system was both the source of Aztec wealth and the foundation of their eventual downfall. Conquered peoples were required to send regular payments of goods, food, and human captives to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. The tribute lists that survived the conquest show the staggering scale of this system. Thousands of tons of maize, beans, and other foodstuffs, along with luxury goods like jade, gold, and exotic feathers. But the human tribute was what really created lasting hatred against Aztec rule. Subject cities were required to provide captives for the constant stream of human sacrifices that Aztec religion demanded. These weren't just enemy warriors captured in battle. They were often young people from conquered communities, taken from their families to have their hearts cut out on Aztec temple pyramids. The psychological impact of this tribute system cannot be overstated. Imagine living in a city where every few months, Aztec officials would arrive to collect not just your food and valuables, but also your children and neighbors for ritual murder. The resentment this created was so deep and widespread that when the Spanish arrived, they found potential allies everywhere they looked. The Tlaxcalans were perhaps the most important example of this anti-Aztec sentiment. This confederation of city-states had been fighting the Aztecs for decades, maintaining their independence through constant warfare. When Cortés arrived, the Tlaxcalans initially fought the Spanish, but quickly realized that these newcomers represented an opportunity to finally defeat their hated enemies. The alliance between Spanish and Tlaxcalans wasn't just a military partnership, it was a meeting of mutual interests. The Spanish needed local allies who understood the terrain, the political situation, and Aztec military tactics. The Tlaxcalans needed allies with superior weapons and different fighting techniques that could break the military stalemate they'd been locked in with the Aztecs for generations. This pattern of alliance building was repeated throughout the conquest. City after city that had been forced to pay tribute to the Aztecs saw the Spanish as liberators rather than conquerors. The final assault on Tenochtitlan involved not just a few hundred Spanish soldiers, but tens of thousands of native warriors who were fighting to free themselves from Aztec domination. The invisible killer, disease. The most devastating weapon the Spanish brought to the New World wasn't steel or gunpowder. It was smallpox. This disease, along with typhus, measles, and other Old World illnesses, killed more Aztecs than all the Spanish weapons combined. But the impact of disease went far beyond just the death toll. It fundamentally disrupted Aztec society in ways that made effective resistance impossible. Smallpox arrived in Mexico around 1520, probably carried by an infected African slave in the Spanish expedition. The disease spread like wildfire through populations that had no natural immunity to Old World diseases. Within months, it had reached Tenochtitlan and was killing thousands of people every day. The timing of the epidemic couldn't have been worse for the Aztecs. The disease struck just as they were trying to organize resistance against the Spanish invasion. Cuitlahuac, who had become emperor after the Spanish killed Moctezuma, died of smallpox after ruling for only 80 days. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, had to try to defend the empire while dealing with a population that was literally dying around him. But the social disruption caused by disease was even more damaging than the deaths themselves. Aztec society was highly organized and hierarchical, with complex systems for everything from food distribution to military organization. When large portions of the population became sick or died, these systems broke down completely. Agricultural production collapsed as farmers died or became too sick to work their fields. The elaborate system of chinampas, floating gardens, that fed Tenochtitlan required constant maintenance that became impossible when the workforce was decimated by disease. Food shortages weakened the population further, making them even more susceptible to illness. Military organization was similarly disrupted. The Aztec military system depended on experienced warriors who had trained for years in specialized combat techniques. When disease killed large numbers of these veterans, the Aztecs lost not just manpower, but also the knowledge and skills needed to fight effectively. The psychological impact of the epidemics was perhaps most devastating of all. Aztec religion taught that disease was a punishment from the gods, and the fact that the Spanish seemed largely immune to the illnesses that were killing Aztecs by the thousands suggested that the Spanish gods were more powerful than Aztec deities. Religious crisis and paralyzed leadership. The arrival of the Spanish created a religious crisis that paralyzed Aztec decision-making at the worst possible time. Aztec religion was built around complex prophecies and beliefs about the return of gods, and Cortez's arrival seemed to fulfill several of these prophecies in ways that left Aztec leaders uncertain about how to respond. Moctezuma II, the Aztec emperor when the Spanish arrived, was particularly affected by these religious concerns. Some accounts suggest he initially believed Cortez might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl, whose arrival had been prophesied for centuries. Whether or not this is literally true, it's clear that Moctezuma was paralyzed by uncertainty about the religious significance of Spanish arrival. This religious paralysis had practical consequences that proved fatal to the empire. Instead of immediately attacking the small Spanish force when they first landed, Moctezuma sent gifts and ambassadors, trying to determine whether these strangers were gods, men, or something in between. This delay gave the Spanish crucial time to establish alliances with local enemies of the Aztecs. Aztec religious practices also worked against them during the conquest. The emphasis on capturing enemies alive for sacrifice rather than killing them in battle meant that Aztec warriors often tried to take Spanish soldiers prisoner rather than simply killing them. This gave the Spanish tactical advantages they wouldn't have had against enemies who were trying to kill them outright. Prophecies and omens that had been building for years before Spanish arrival had already created anxiety and uncertainty among Aztec leadership. Reports of strange lights in the sky, unusual animal behavior, and other portents had convinced many Aztecs that some kind of catastrophic change was coming. When the Spanish arrived, they seemed to fulfill these dark prophecies. Political instability and succession crises. The Aztec political system was more fragile than it appeared from the outside. The empire was held together by the personal authority of the emperor and a complex network of noble families who competed for power and influence. When this system was disrupted by Spanish arrival and the deaths of key leaders, the empire began to fragment. Moctezuma's capture by the Spanish in 1519 created an immediate political crisis. The emperor was the religious and political center of the entire system, and his imprisonment by foreigners was unprecedented in Aztec history. The nobles and priests who normally looked to him for leadership were left without clear guidance about how to respond to this crisis. Cuitlahuac's brief reign showed what might have been possible if the Aztecs had been able to maintain political stability. He successfully organized the resistance that drove the Spanish out of Tenochtitlan during the famous Noche Triste, Night of Sorrows, when Cortez's forces suffered heavy casualties and barely escaped the city. But Cuitlahuac's death from smallpox after just 80 days in power eliminated the one leader who had proven capable of effective resistance. Cuauhtémoc, the final Aztec emperor, was young and inexperienced when he came to power in 1521. He had to try to defend the empire while dealing with disease epidemics, food shortages, political instability, and a massive alliance of enemies that included not just the Spanish, but tens of thousands of native warriors who wanted to destroy Aztec power. The power of native alliances. The Spanish conquest was really a native civil war in which the Spanish served as the catalyst and provided crucial military advantages to one side. The final assault on Tenochtitlan involved an estimated 200,000 native warriors fighting alongside fewer than 1,000 Spanish soldiers. Without these massive native alliances, the conquest would have been impossible. The Tlaxcalan Confederation provided the largest and most important contingent of anti-Aztec forces. These warriors were experienced, well-trained, and highly motivated to destroy Aztec power. They knew Aztec military tactics, understood the terrain around Tenochtitlan, and could provide the manpower needed for a sustained siege of the Aztec capital. Other subject peoples joined the anti-Aztec alliance as Spanish forces moved toward Tenochtitlan. Cities that had been forced to pay tribute to the Aztecs saw an opportunity to free themselves from this burden and join the growing coalition. Each new ally provided additional warriors, supplies, and local knowledge that strengthened the Spanish position. The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was really a siege by native forces with Spanish leadership and Spanish weapons. The tens of thousands of native warriors did most of the actual fighting, while the Spanish provided tactical leadership, superior weapons, and the psychological advantage of seeming to have divine support. Spanish military advantages. While Spanish military technology wasn't sufficient by itself to conquer the Aztec Empire, it did provide crucial advantages that tipped the balance in key battles. Steel weapons, firearms, horses, and different tactical approaches gave Spanish forces capabilities that Aztec warriors had never encountered before. Steel weapons were more durable and effective than Aztec obsidian-edged clubs and spears. While obsidian could be sharper than steel, it was also brittle and could shatter during combat. Spanish swords and pikes could be used repeatedly without breaking, and were more effective against the cotton armor that Aztec warriors wore. Firearms and crossbows provided Spanish forces with ranged weapons that were more powerful and accurate than Aztec atlatls and bows. While early firearms were slow to reload and unreliable, they created psychological effects that were often more important than their actual killing power. The noise and smoke of gunpowder weapons terrified enemies who had never encountered them before. Horses gave Spanish forces mobility advantages that were crucial in a campaign that covered hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. Cavalry could move quickly between battlefields, pursue fleeing enemies, and provide shock value in combat. The psychological impact of mounted warriors was enormous among peoples who had never seen horses before. The final siege and collapse. The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was one of the most brutal and destructive sieges in human history. The city, built on an island in Lake Texcoco, was cut off from food and water supplies while being attacked from all sides by Spanish and native forces. Starvation and disease killed more defenders than combat during the 93-day siege. The Spanish strategy was to starve the city into submission rather than risk heavy casualties and direct assaults. As food ran out, the defenders were reduced to eating bark, grass, and anything else they could find. Water supply became critical as the siege continued. The Spanish cut the aqueducts that brought fresh water to the city, forcing defenders to drink the brackish water of the lake. This contaminated water spread disease and weakened the population further. Cuauhtémoc's capture on August 13, 1521, marked the official end of the Aztec Empire. The young emperor was trying to escape by canoe when he was captured by Spanish forces. His surrender ended organized resistance, though scattered fighting continued for several more years. The aftermath of the conquest was devastating for the native population. Disease continued to kill thousands of people. The tribute system was replaced by Spanish colonial exploitation, and traditional Aztec culture was systematically suppressed by Spanish authorities and Catholic missionaries. The fall of the Aztec Empire wasn't the result of Spanish superiority or inevitable European dominance. It was the result of a perfect storm of factors that combined to destroy a civilization that had dominated central Mexico for centuries. Disease epidemics, massive native alliances, political instability, religious crisis, and Spanish military advantages all worked together to create a cascade of disasters that no empire could have survived. Understanding what actually happened to the Aztecs reveals important lessons about how civilizations rise and fall. The Aztec Empire's greatest strength, its ability to extract tribute from conquered peoples, became its greatest weakness when those same peoples allied with Spanish invaders to destroy their oppressors. The real story of the conquest is far more complex and interesting than the simple narrative of European technological superiority. It shows how internal contradictions, external pressures, and unexpected events can combine to bring down even the most powerful civilizations in remarkably short periods of time.